Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, The Growing Threat of Synthetic Identity Fraud. My name is Heather McKay, and I am a Senior Marketing Manager here at Ekata, joined today by our presenter, Kurt Weiss, our Strategic Account Executive for Financial Services. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. All participant lines are muted during the presentation. If you have questions, feel free to enter them into the questions box, and they will be addressed at the conclusion of today's presentation. The slides and the recording from today will be sent via emails within a few days after we conclude. Now I will pass it over to Kurt to get started.
Hey everyone, how you doing? My name's Kurt, and I'm coming to you all live from the Ekata home office here. Before you all start wondering what all those ticks were, when we first went into quarantine, I was marking off the days, and I think somewhere around 90 or so, I gave up on that. But thank you all for taking the time to join today. As Heather mentioned, we are talking about synthetic identity today. Because it is a really growing threat of fraud, and it's also a global one. So we're seeing this across all of the countries that Ekata really works with, and it's challenging for a number of reasons as a result of that. But the key behind that is really just the evolution that fraud has taken has really enabled synthetic identity to grow as a threat. And we kind of live in a world today now where the fraud that we're all fighting against is really sponsored. It's sponsored through organized crime. And it's also sponsored often now by states. There's a lot of state-sponsored farms that are out there that are committing these. And what that's led to is there's a big change in the tools that these hackers and criminals have. And it's important that we think of them now as careerists, right? This is effectively, maybe not a 9-to-5 job, but this is something that folks are waking up and doing every day. And as a result, they have a tremendous amount of patience. They can wait on these things. They have that sponsorship and financial backing behind them to take the time to hatch more sophisticated schemes. And it also means they can learn. These are broad networks. They're sharing information the same way that ideally on our side, the good guys are as well. And so we really have to adopt our approach to that. And two other things are really supporting them here as well. One of those is just the compute power that these folks have access to, and the democratization of data science and machine learning, paired with all of the data breaches that we've all seen. And what this means is there's now a tremendous amount of data out there, and these folks who are showing up to work every day to commit fraud have all of the computer power and the data science they need to leverage that into something meaningful. And really what we get out of that is synthetic identities. So what is a synthetic identity? It's really a composite of an identity. It takes real information to create someone that doesn't exist. But if we try to identify each one of these individual attributes that go into them, each one of these is going to be good. That's a real address. It's a real phone number. That's a real social security number. And so it becomes really hard to rely on, just single input fields to understand what's going on here. The big kind of key thing that enables this as well, again, as I mentioned, are the data breaches. And this is where a lot of the social security numbers that are really key to this scheme come from. And so many of them are actually effectively social security numbers for folks who are, small children who haven't entered the credit industry at all. They're not using their social security number for anything. And so that number can be taken and the identity can be created around it. And that's what these synthetic identity fraudsters seek to do. They are using this identity they've created to create a credit header and build up their credit. And that's where that patience comes, because the goal of all of this is to bust out, to develop this identity into a stable credit header so that they can take out a large loan, a credit card with a high limit on it, and have no intention of ever resolving their debt with the institution that they've taken that out with. And so let's jump quickly, Heather, if you can address our first poll question here.
Sure. So I'm going to launch our first poll question. What we want to know is, what are your top concerns with onboarding customers? So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of time to answer the poll. Take your time and let us know. If you don't see a selection that matches with your issue, just feel free to click other and type your answer into the chat box. All right, so just one more second, and then we're going to close the poll. All right. So there you are, Kurt. There are the results of our poll question.
Awesome. These are great stats to see. And I think a lot of trends are kind of up there with what we're seeing when we talk about account opening as really being the point of attack, because this is where we see those stolen identities, the synthetic identities really coming into play. And same with the bots as well. But the one that I really liked there was the customer friction piece, because the challenge with this being a point of attack for so many of these frauds is, that's a huge number there, 3.4 billion in account opening losses due to fraud. But this is also our customer acquisition tool, right? This is where we need to bring those good customers in so that we can start offering the products that we have to sell. And, we live in a world where I'm going to go on to Amazon and everything is instant. I think we probably hear some analogy along those lines in every webinar we're on these days, but it really affects the way that consumers are thinking. And they want a frictionless experience. They want something to be open fast. They want to have access to it now. But when we have that looming threat of fraud over, that becomes the piece that we really have to balance against it. And that's what makes this a really crucial area in which we've got to deal with these things. And, in a recent study that we saw, about 80% of folks had customer experience as the goal of what they're accomplishing at onboarding, right? They want to provide the best customer experience. And that kind of tips me to think of this almost more as like a marketing flow, right? This is the customer journey. Underneath it, we have things like fraud and KYC and credit scores, but really this is the, sales enablement, allowing customers to come in, offer quick things in order to get access to these products. And that's especially true in sort of the growth of fintech and trying to bring new identities, right, the underbanked, into the banking system. The goal of so many products that are coming out on the market today are imploring folks who haven't normally engaged with the banking system to come into it, to join up with, higher interest products, other means of growing their credit, prepaid cards, etc., as that tool of customer acquisition, so that those folks can enter more and more mature markets. And what that means is these synthetic identities are able to really easily ride the wave of that into the system. And it's often at those sort of easier entry points where they're trying to take on these new customers where synthetic identities can first establish themselves. And what's also challenging there is those institutions at sort of the front end of the system aren't the ones who experience the fraud. Again, that patience is really important. And what we'll see is that a synthetic identity fraudster needs to pay off his first couple of loans, or be a good customer on that credit card in order to establish themselves for that bust out, for that big payday that they're after. And that's where all that patience comes in for them, their ability to sit on these identities, for up to 7 years or longer, which makes it, again, very hard for everyone to identify these. And outcomes, as we'll talk about, are really important here. It's really important that we understand whether someone was a synthetic identity or not, as they commit that fraud. And that takes a tremendous amount of resources from the institution themselves to investigate their fraud, and especially investigate their defaults. Most of the time, synthetic identity fraud is going to be considered first-party fraud. There's sort of a third party behind it, but it's a real identity that at the end of the day defaulted on a loan. And so stolen identities came up on our list and was pretty high. And I think we could do a whole nother webinar on those. But I really wanted to call out, again, just the difference in the behaviors between these two. And they're really starting to come neck and neck. Right now, we've seen different polling that in terms of the fraud that folks are experiencing and considering a big concern, about 55% right now is stolen, and 45% and growing is that synthetic identity fraud. And I think one of the reasons for the growth in it is if we look at the stolen identities, what we have here is something that often is going to require some form of social engineering. We're learning more and more about fraudsters who are actually reaching out and contacting the victim of their fraud directly and saying, hey, you're about to get this text, or please let me know what number you just received from this bank, so that they can pass through and take control of that account or take control of that identity. And that just means that it's not as scalable as the synthetic identity frauds, where we're taking all of this data that's out there and we're using all this data science to create multiple identities off of the same information, right? It really becomes just a factor of permutation, how much you can get out of a single address or a single email as you combine them with different social security numbers and phone numbers. That's also obviously why fighting synthetic identity is going to be so difficult. Right now we just sort of lack all of the tools that we need in order to fight synthetic identity. And it's a growing sort of suite of products. It's a growing expertise for everyone. And I think it's really key that we start trying to do that together. Because on one hand, we have that issue at the institution themselves, the detection and the categorization, right? Again, often these accounts will present no initial risk. They might actually be paying off their loans, like we've mentioned. These are nurtured IDs that they're sitting on and waiting to create them into more and more of a passable identity. And that categorization then becomes really important when we do stumble upon these. We need to do the investigation to understand if this was synthetic so that we can start to correlate the right tools around that. And that tooling, that really comes down to just the lack of experience that we have right now, as well as the knowledge sharing that exists. And we'll talk a lot more about the signals that can be employed and that are employed to approach synthetic identities and call them out. But we need a feedback loop from customers and banks in order to understand what exactly these synthetic identities were and separate them out from the other types of fraud. The last piece, as we mentioned just a ton, is that fraudster sophistication. They have the resources, they have the time to sit on these, allow them to develop into really undetectable identities that will pass off as good. And so this really calls for a new approach and new data to how we try to combat this type of fraud. And there's really two kind of data sets that we need to consider here. We refer to them as deterministic and probabilistic. And deterministic is a type of data where the output value is definitive in and of itself. So I think of there things like KYC, asking if someone lives at an address. The answer to that is the answer that you are looking for. Do they live there or not? It's often binary. Similarly, if we're trying to do some kind of one-time passcode to a mobile phone, we might call out to a data provider to understand, hey, is this phone number a mobile phone before I go out and share a passcode with it? Again, the value that you're seeking there is definitive. It's the answer that you're looking for. On the probabilistic side, we're dealing with data where the value that you're getting is correlative. On its own, it's not giving you the answer that you're looking for. We need those outcomes. We need to understand the fraud, the event that we're trying to associate it with in order to make that data valuable. And so this is where we see a lot of great information coming through in networks and looking at the behavior of identities. So one thing I think is a really cool piece that we look here at Akata is when an email was first paired to a phone. Now, in and of itself, that's not answering any direct question. However, when we start to understand how that relates to fraud, now we see that the longer that we've had that pairing, the more likely that that is going to be a good customer. And the earlier that we've made that connection, the more likely it is to be fraud. Same thing when we look at things like volatility. This is trying to understand, okay, we have an email address. How many different phone numbers is that email address associated with? How many different addresses is that email address associated with? This really starts to try to understand what's the stability of this identity. It's very normal for myself, as a good customer, I hope, where I have about 3 or 4 emails and 2 phone numbers that they might be associated with in any given account. And so we can correlate that behavior with good customers like myself. However, when we see a phone number like mine that's now associated with 100 different phones, that starts to correlate to outcomes of fraud and becomes a really big risk signal that we employ. The other key thing on the probabilistic data are just all taking advantage of all of the machine learning scores that we can now derive. And again, unlike a credit score where my credit score means I'm either going to get that loan or not, a machine learning score, like some of the ones that Akata comes up to, needs to be trained against the outcomes that you have. Our score of 400 doesn't necessarily mean or guarantee that that customer is fraud. What we do is we test and we try to correlate that data to understand what's the detection capture rate when someone has a given score, and what are the false positives? What are the good customers that might get caught up in using that cut point? And so that probabilistic data becomes one of the most important tools we have when we're trying to fight against synthetic identities, because really what we're trying to do here is look at the totality of the identity, right? If we're sitting there looking at a picture, we're at an art gallery looking at a Monet, we want to be able to see the entire picture in one view so that we can identify that neon pink brush in the corner that is the obscure thing that shouldn't be there, that can tip us off that this isn't a real Monet, this is actually a synthetic, right? This is a bad identity. And so a lot of the ways that we approach this at Akata are through data linkages. And this is taking some of our basic kind of static data, looking at, hey, do we have an email to name match? Do we have a phone to name match? Just looking at each individual element to understand if the owner that has been presented to the institution is the owner that we have on file. And the key thing again here is, one-to-one, we may find that these are good, right? It's very likely that that email matches the name, that that phone matches the name, but we want to look at all of those together and see how many matches exist. Because where we start to see, well, this is good, but this is off, in totality now we can start to understand and see the breakdowns of the synthetic identity. I think leveraging IP is really, really important here as well. IP is going to be one of the harder signals for a synthetic identity fraudster to mask consistently, and especially to have in a location that is close to where those individuals are actually conducting from, where their phone is, where their house is. And so we use that calculation often. How far away from the phone, how far away from the address provided is that IP? Because again, those correlate to the type of behavior that can be seen with synthetic identities. And on the other side, we've talked about this a bit, but that behavior, right? The network signals that we can look into to understand how are these elements acting in relation to each other? What is normal behavior, right? Having that phone paired to one or two emails versus having that phone paired to over 100 emails. And these become the really key signals if we're going to approach synthetic identity. And the big piece here is we have to take them all together. We need to look at these in their totality. There's not going to be one single data point here that can call out consistently this is a synthetic identity fraud. What we're trying to understand is, how do these all add up? Where is the inconsistency? Where is the weak link? And that will allow us to start identifying these synthetic identities and leveling up the risk on those applications so that the appropriate decisions can be made on them. And that becomes the really key piece, of course, is like, what do we do now that we have these? And this comes back to that concept of the customer experience, right? This is sort of a generic workflow of onboarding a customer for some kind of credit product. Very modular. Oftentimes we're seeing credit become before things like KYC and risk. Oftentimes we're seeing it come after. But the trend that I think is really impactful right now that we're seeing across the industry is the combination of the identity fraud risk with the KYC. And that really is this nature of bringing the probabilistic data elements and harnessing them alongside your core customer due diligence practices. And the key reason here is we need to figure out what the right challenge is to present to these customers. So that is often triggered by the anti-money laundering or KYC, where the information isn't enough to verify that customer. And so we need to provide some kind of step-up authentication to say, hey, please, scan or upload a copy of your driver's license. Give us these documents. Or something as simple as, we're going to send a one-time passcode to your mobile phone number. But these things need to take in consideration that probabilistic data set that can come from the identity risk assessment. That should inform how you're approaching those step-up authentications so that you can further identify, hey, this customer might actually be a lot riskier than I believe they are, because my KYC isn't really set up to identify a synthetic identity. And on the flip side, right, we need the fidelity on those good customers so that we can also move them out of those high friction workflows and the probabilistic data is going to be fantastic at also correlating to the good and being able to say, hey, while you're not sure, we can be very confident. So as you look for that assurance, how can you still provide that customer with the best experience so that we don't have that dropout, we don't lower our conversion rates, but at the same time, we're not contributing to that 3.4 billion fraud number. So with that, we're going to turn it back to you guys for a little poll question about how you guys are implementing some of those authentications.
All right, so here's our next poll question. Take about 40 seconds to respond, and if you do have others that are not included in the selection, feel free to type your answer into the chat box. Okay, just a few more seconds. And the poll is now closed. And here are the results.
Really interesting stuff here. This is an area that Ekata doesn't necessarily specialize in, but we're learning more and more about how folks are leveraging these different tools and what the effect on them is. Interesting to see such high numbers with the knowledge-based authentication. I think one thing that we're hearing often there is that becomes a real drag on the consumer, and oftentimes fraudsters are able to pass those better than some good customers. And so it becomes a challenging one to implement. But at the same time, that and the one-time passcode are certainly the lighter weight pieces and the ones that are much easier for customers to pass through. Even though I get frustrated every time, I have to wait 8-10 seconds for that text to come through on my phone to provide that passcode. It's something that I'm becoming more habituated to, and it's certainly a lot easier than some kind of document verification step, which, certainly I don't think my mom or my dad would have an easy time completing, but I might bail out on as well. And I think that's really the important thing to consider is what is going into the decision making on how you distribute those authentications. What is the answer that you guys are seeking at these institutions? What is the due diligence that you need versus what is the intelligence that you can bring to light through passive authentication that can impact how you deliver those step-up authentications? And I think that's where probabilistic risk, the type of signals that Ekata provides, is really impactful in segmenting the population to identify, right, who are the really good customers, who are those who are suspected of fraud, how many fall in the middle, and how can we then use that to affect the workflows we're putting each customer through. And when that is relegated to an after the fact experience where you've run through all of your due diligence and now all you're looking for is if this person's fraud, we've got to do even more friction to get them out. You're not leveraging those positive signals that can help earlier on signify, hey, we're going to do this in one step. We can combine this to understand what type of experience are we going to deliver to this customer, knowing the totality of what we do about them, as well as what we need to comply with. And I think that is a key thing to keep in mind. And again, the really, really important thing to triggering all this and doing it successfully is creating a partnership where that probabilistic data has the meaning that you're looking for it to have. And that has everything to do with working on developing exactly what those fraud outcomes are, doing the research and understanding, hey, it's not just that that person didn't pay us back, but can we call them down? Are we getting inbound calls about, complaints about a social security number that's been compromised, things along those lines, so that we can correctly label this? That will allow further and further downstream folks to identify synthetic identity when it first comes into the system and prevent them from creating these identities that can pass through as they move up and have larger and larger bust outs. And the goal always, I think, when we talk about fraud that we have to balance against is that experience for good customers. All of the friction that we're placing is going to be a negative for any of our good customers. They're going to drop out. And so as much as we can do to passively collect information, passively understand what are these identities, who are these individuals, and do we believe they're the actual owners of this information who are hitting submit, right? Or is the individual at the end of this a fraudster because this identity has been composited across different breaches and emails that can be created, at the drop of a hat? That's sort of the big question that we have to answer without the customers sort of knowing that's what we're pondering, and making sure that we can move them along towards the products that they're looking for. All right, and I think we'll pause here. Heather, are we going to take some questions?
So we do have a couple of questions that came through, Kurt, that I want to read off to you. The first one that we have is, do you need to have separate models set up for synthetic ID?
It's a really, really good question. So I think we hear this one a lot, and again, it comes down to the outcomes and what is available. We work with a very few number of financial institutions that are spending the time to identify and label their synthetic identity fraud at such a scale that they can actually train a model against it. And as I mentioned a few times, those outcomes are really key. For the most part, what we're seeing is folks are attacking synthetic identity fraud through their core fraud models, and using the data that we have, which again, it will correlate to those synthetic identities, but you won't be able to understand without those outcomes to know whether the fraudster that you stopped was synthetic or more third-party fraud.
Great. Okay, so we have two more questions here that came through. Does it matter where in the workflow we address synthetic ID?
I don't think it matters where in the workflow this is addressed. I think what we're seeing is actually, especially in COVID, as some folks have tightened up their sort of credit requirements, because it does take time to build up a lot of these synthetic identities to meet those. Some folks, by tightening up their credit scoring, have actually prevented a lot of the synthetic identity fraud that's occurring. But again, that's not really the ideal situation. You don't want to limit the customers that you're able to bring on unless that's the decision you need to make there. I think the key is aligning it with things like your KYC so that you can incorporate the probabilistic signals with the step-up authentications that you're already employing, because it's that friction that you're asserting on the customer that is going to help separate those fraudsters out who, while it was easy for them to create this identity, they aren't going to have the documentation to support it.
Great, thank you. And so the final question that we had come through, so how does Ekata confirm that something is identity fraud?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll double down again on the outcomes and how important those are to understand what you're looking at. Akata has some really great data on name, phone, email, address, and IP, and that gives us that full picture of an identity, and it allows us to put higher risk signals and flag individuals who who are exhibiting that behavior of inconsistency in the way their identity is put together. And so we don't have the ability to say, hey, this is stolen identity, this is synthetic identity. Again, we need to correlate that data against those known outcomes in order to start calling it those things. But beyond that, again, this is probabilistic data. So it's correlating towards what you're seeing as fraud.
Great, thank you. Well,
That answers that.
yeah, that concludes all of the questions that we actually had come through today. So I want to thank everyone for their time in joining us. And as I mentioned, when we open, the slides and the recording will be sent out a few days after our presentation today. So thanks again. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day and a good weekend, and we'll see you on another event soon.
Thank you all for joining.